The Russian military bombards Ukraine's Donbas region as it steps up its all-out offensive. The Ukrainian president promises a tough fight, saying his country will yield nothing.
And for a closer look at the new phase in the Ukraine war, we're joined by Shea from Chatham House. Mr. Shea, 54 days of war. Earlier, our correspondent told us this new phase, we're looking at a very different terrain for Russia and Ukraine, both sides learning from mistakes in the first part of this war. And morale, for better or for worse, Ukraine and Russia, as we look ahead to this new phase, what do you see happening for Russia and Ukraine?
Well, we're certainly now going towards a much more conventional type of military confrontation with Russian tanks on the one side and heavy artillery, and Ukrainian tanks and artillery on the other side. So we're moving away from these sort of clashes that we had before in the first phase, which was spread across Ukrainian territory, where small groups of Russian soldiers were fighting small groups of Ukrainian soldiers, essentially in cities and towns. So this means, of course, that the NATO countries, the West, have to make sure that the Ukrainian army has the new type of equipment that it's going to need for this new type of battle, which means, of course, aircraft, air defense systems, artillery, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and that the Ukrainians not just get this equipment quickly before the Russians can seize a lot of territory in the east, but also that the NATO countries can train the Ukrainian army to use this equipment, particularly where it's sophisticated Western equipment, quickly and effectively.
We've heard from the deputy head of President Zelensky's office saying Ukraine is finally getting the kind of heavy weaponry it needs. We're also hearing reports of the US training Ukrainian army to use howitzers. So is this exactly what we need to see for Ukraine to finally turn the tide, or not finally, to win the war against Russia?
Well, at least for the time being, to stop Russia advancing too far and seizing more territory, particularly in the east, the entire Donbas region, or the entirety of Ukraine's Black Sea coast, which, of course, would, in terms of the loss of important trading ports, like Gdansk or Mariupol or Odessa, would be catastrophic for the Ukrainian economy. So, yes, indeed, it's good news that NATO countries are stepping up. You may have seen in recent days, for example, the Czech Republic transferring T-72 tanks or Slovakia transferring S-300 air defense systems. But this is the old Soviet Union era equipment, which, of course, the Ukrainian army has been using for many years. But NATO does not have very large stocks of this old Soviet era equipment. And therefore, the key thing is to train the Ukrainians quickly on systems that they're not familiar with, like Switchblade American drones or new types of artillery. And so this training, it can be in the United States, it can be in Eastern Europe, but it has to take place very quickly, and it has to be a train-the-trainers concept. So the expertise which is given outside Ukraine to certain Ukrainian soldiers can then be trained to other Ukrainian soldiers once they are back inside Ukraine. The other thing is that the Russians, of course, know that this heavy equipment is coming. So you've seen already that they are employing missile strikes against railway lines and roads to try to interdict or destroy this Western equipment. So the NATO countries have to make certain that they have secure and varied lines of communication to make sure that this equipment gets to the east, to the Ukrainians, as quickly as possible.
Mr. Shea, now you've worked for NATO for 38 years before joining Chatham House. One of the concerns we heard in the earlier days of the war was NATO's worries that it did not want to escalate conflict in Ukraine by being seen to be sending offensive weapons to Ukraine. Howitzers, I take it, are definitely offensive weapons. Is that concern no longer a concern for NATO at this point?
Well, I would say two things. First of all military weapons are either offensive or defensive. It depends how you use them. And of course, everything that NATO countries are giving to Ukraine is being used defensively. I mean, the Ukrainians are not attacking Russia. They have no ambition or possibility to do that, they're defending their own territory against an unprovoked invasion. And so this is legitimate self-defense under the Charter of the United Nations. The second thing is that, of course, over the last couple of weeks, Russia itself has been escalating the conflict by striking cities, striking civilian targets. We now have massive evidence of atrocities, massacres, having been committed in several towns and villages, such as Bucha, by Russian soldiers. We have also environmental war in terms of Russia destroying oil refineries and chemical plants and nitric acid plants and so on. So to some degree, it's Russia that's been escalating the level of violence. And therefore, what NATO is doing is really simply responding to that by giving Ukraine now the type of weapons that it still needs for legitimate self-defense. So I don't think the NATO mandate has changed in any way. It's simply that what is needed for defense in this second phase, which you rightly referred to at the beginning, is different in terms of the type of equipment than what we saw with those sort of light shoulder-fired Stinger anti-tank weapons or Javelin anti-tank weapons, Stinger anti-air weapons in the first phase. So it's a question of adjusting quickly to a fast-moving situation.
Mr. Shea, final question here. We're hearing news of prisoner swaps between Ukraine and Russia. Is this strategy, something that's new? Is it unique to this war? In your experience, what do these exchanges serve in the longer run?
Well, certainly if they mean that soldiers on both sides can have their lives spared, which is key, particularly with full respect by Russia of the Geneva Conventions when it comes to the fair treatment of prisoners of war, this is essential. And it's something that's not new, no, because as you know, and as your viewers know, since 2014, Russia has been in parts of the Donbas, in Luhansk and Donetsk. A lot of fighting has been going on already for 8 years. 14,000 people have been killed. Hundreds of thousands have been forced to leave their homes. And during this period, there have been periodically, although on a small scale, exchanges of prisoners between the Ukrainian and the Russian forces. And so I expect there would be more of these in the future, because clearly the Russians would like to get their soldiers back. They don't have an infinite number of soldiers, which is why they're trying to recruit Chechens and Syrians and other mercenaries. And of course, the Ukrainians will do their utmost, for instance, when it comes to those soldiers that are trapped in Mariupol at the moment under the Russian siege, to try to get their own people and also those foreign fighters that have been helping Ukraine home.
Thanks so much indeed.
So this is not new, and I expect there will be more of this.
All right. Thanks so much for all those insights. Shea, Associate Fellow of the International Security Program at Chatham House.